Dispatch, we've got a vehicle refusing commands. Driver compliant? Negative. Is he armed? Unknown. A pause fills the radio channel. Then the officer's voice comes back. Tense. He's starting the car. Block him in. Too late. He's moving. Tires screech across the pavement as the engine roars. Stop the vehicle. But the driver isn't stopping. And in the next few seconds on a street in Newark, a routine detention will spiral into a confrontation that ends with gunfire. What happened in those final moments would soon become the center of an intense investigation. The encounter began like many police interactions do, routine, controlled, and seemingly predictable. Officers had responded to a situation involving a vehicle and a driver who needed to be detained for questioning. The details of the call were still developing, but what officers knew was that the driver had drawn attention from law enforcement earlier that evening. When police units located the vehicle, they approached cautiously. Standard procedure requires officers to control the scene quickly, especially when dealing with a vehicle stop. Cars can easily become escape tools or worse, weapons. That's why officers typically position themselves strategically around a vehicle. One officer may approach the driver's side. Another watches the passenger side. Additional units remain nearby in case the situation escalates. That night, officers in Newark followed those same procedures. At first, everything appeared under control. The vehicle had stopped. Officers began speaking with the driver, but something about the situation quickly shifted. Witnesses later described the moment when tension first appeared. One resident watching from across the street said the conversation between the driver and the officers seemed calm at first. Then suddenly, the driver's body language changed. The officer nearest the driver reportedly issued commands. Turn the vehicle off. Step out of the car. But the driver didn't comply. Instead, he remained seated behind the wheel, hands near the steering wheel, eyes focused forward. For officers, moments like this are unpredictable. A suspect inside a vehicle has several options: comply, flee, or use the car itself as a weapon. And in many cases, officers only realize which option the driver has chosen when it's already happening. Police training emphasizes situational awareness during vehicle stops. Cars provide mobility, power, and the ability to escape quickly. If a driver suddenly accelerates, officers nearby can be put in serious danger. Because of this, officers often issue commands clearly and repeatedly, giving the driver multiple opportunities to comply. That's exactly what officers in Newark did. Turn the car off. Show me your hands. Step out of the vehicle. But the driver still didn't move. Seconds passed. For the officers surrounding the vehicle, the silence inside the car began to feel like a warning. One officer reportedly stepped slightly backward to create distance. Another kept their attention locked on the driver's hands. Because hands tell the story. Are they reaching for something? Are they gripping the steering wheel? Are they preparing to drive? Every movement matters. And then it happened. The engine revved. The sudden roar shattered the tense silence. Witnesses later said the sound instantly changed the atmosphere. One neighbor recalled hearing officers shout commands. Don't move. Turn the car off. But the driver didn't listen. Instead, the vehicle lurched forward. In that instant, the situation transformed. What had been a detention suddenly became a potential escape attempt. And for the officers standing nearby, the moving vehicle represented a serious threat. A car can weigh several thousand pounds. Even at low speed, it can cause devastating injuries. Officers must quickly decide whether the vehicle is simply attempting to flee, or whether it's being used aggressively toward them. Those decisions happen in seconds, sometimes less. Witnesses described the car moving forward abruptly. One officer reportedly jumped backward to avoid being struck. Another officer shouted again for the driver to stop. But the vehicle continued moving, and now the risk to the officers had become immediate. Police policies regarding vehicles vary by department, but many share similar principles. Deadly force may be used if an officer believes a vehicle is being used in a way that could seriously injure or kill someone. But these situations are extremely complicated. because the difference between a fleeing driver and an attacking vehicle can be measured in a fraction of a second. That's what investigators would later focus on, the exact moment when the officer believed the vehicle posed a deadly threat. Witnesses say the vehicle accelerated again. The movement was quick, abrupt, and dangerously close to the officers. Then the gunshots rang out. Several loud cracks echoed down the street. The vehicle slowed almost immediately, and then it stopped. For a moment, the entire scene fell silent. The engine still running, police lights flashing across nearby buildings, residents watching from doorways and windows. Then the radio traffic exploded with urgency. Shots fired. Driver hit. Get medical here now. Officers quickly approached the vehicle, moving carefully. The driver was still inside. Paramedics were already being called to the scene. Other officers secured the area, ensuring there were no additional threats. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived. The driver was removed from the vehicle and treated by paramedics. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the shooting were escorted away from the immediate scene. This is standard procedure after an officer discharges a weapon. It ensures that the investigation can proceed properly. Soon the street was filled with flashing lights, police vehicles, ambulances, investigators. Crime scene tapes stretched across the area as detectives began documenting what had happened. Because when an officer fires their weapon, the incident immediately becomes the subject of a formal investigation. Every detail matters. Every movement, every second. Detectives began interviewing witnesses. Residents described hearing commands from officers. Then the sound of the car accelerating. Then gunfire. Some said the driver appeared to be trying to escape. Others believed the vehicle came dangerously close to hitting officers. These differing accounts would become important pieces of the investigation. Investigators also collected physical evidence from the scene: shell casings, vehicle positioning, tire marks on the pavement. All of these clues would help reconstruct the timeline of events. But perhaps the most important evidence would come from body cameras. Most modern police departments require officers to wear cameras during interactions with the public. These cameras record both video and audio from the officer's perspective. If the officers involved in the Newark incident had body cameras activated, investigators would analyze that footage frame by frame, looking for the exact moment the threat became immediate. Police officials soon confirmed that an investigation had begun. In incidents like this, multiple agencies typically review the case: internal affairs investigators, independent detectives, and sometimes prosecutors. Their goal is to determine whether the officer's actions were justified under the law and department policy. For residents in Newark, the shooting quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. Do we have eyes on the vehicle? Affirmative. Driver still inside. Hands visible? Negative, can't see clearly. Keep him talking. Sir, turn the engine off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the officer's voice cracked through the radio again. Wait, he's shifting the car. The tension on that street in Newark had been building for several minutes. Now it was about to explode. By the time additional officers arrived, the situation had already become unstable. The driver remained inside the vehicle. The engine was running, and the officers surrounding the car knew that at any moment the driver could make a decision: comply or flee. Vehicle detentions are among the most unpredictable situations officers face. Inside a car, a suspect has mobility, protection, and the ability to accelerate instantly. That combination makes even a routine stop potentially dangerous, which is why officers are trained to control the environment quickly. But that night in Newark, control was slipping. Witnesses said officers repeatedly issued commands: turn the car off, step out of the vehicle, show your hands. Each command echoed across the street, but the driver remained inside. No door opened. No hands appeared outside the window. Instead, the vehicle sat motionless, engine humming quietly. To someone watching from a distance, it might have seemed like a stalemate. But to the officers standing just feet away, every second felt uncertain, because they couldn't see what the driver was doing inside the car. Was he reaching for something? preparing to drive, or simply refusing to comply. In situations like this, officers must prepare for the worst while hoping for cooperation. One officer positioned near the front of the vehicle reportedly moved slightly to the side. Standing directly in front of a vehicle during a tense stop can be extremely dangerous. If the driver suddenly accelerates, there may be no time to move out of the way. So officers adjust their positions carefully, watching, waiting, and repeating commands. Meanwhile, other patrol units had arrived and parked nearby. Their flashing lights cast red and blue reflections across nearby buildings. Residents began gathering at windows and doorways, trying to understand what was happening. Some whispered to each other. Others quietly recorded the scene with their phones. But no one knew exactly what was about to happen. Inside the vehicle, the driver remained silent. No sudden movements, no attempt to open the door, just the low rumble of the engine. For officers, the sound of an engine during a detention is a warning sign, because a running car means the driver can accelerate instantly. And if the driver chooses to flee, officers have almost no time to react. That's why commands continued. Turn the vehicle off, but the engine kept running. Then something changed. One officer noticed the vehicle shift slightly. The subtle movement might have gone unnoticed by someone standing far away, but the officers saw it immediately. A car shifting gears can mean only one thing. The driver is preparing to move. "Don't move!" an officer shouted, but the warning came too late. The vehicle suddenly jerked forward. Tires squealed against the pavement. The car surged ahead. Witnesses later described the moment as chaotic. Officers jumped back to avoid the moving vehicle. One officer shouted again for the driver to stop, but the driver continued accelerating. For the officers standing nearby, the situation had changed in an instant. What had been a detention was now an attempted escape, and possibly something more dangerous. Vehicles can become deadly weapons when used aggressively. A car weighing thousands of pounds moving toward a person can cause severe injury or death. That's why police training treats moving vehicles as potential lethal threats. Officers must quickly determine whether the driver is simply trying to flee, or if the vehicle itself is being used to endanger them. But those judgments happen in seconds, sometimes even less. Witnesses said the car accelerated again, this time faster. One officer reportedly moved quickly to the side as the vehicle came dangerously close. Another officer raised their weapon. The commands continued. Stop the vehicle. But the driver didn't stop. Instead, the car kept moving forward. At that moment, the officers had to make a critical decision. If the vehicle continued accelerating, someone could be seriously injured. The officer nearest the path of the vehicle believed the threat had become immediate. And in those final seconds, hesitation could mean disaster. Gunshots echoed through the street. Several sharp cracks shattered the night air. The vehicle slowed abruptly. Then it rolled to a stop. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then the radios erupted. Shots fired. Driver hit. Call EMS. Officers approached the vehicle cautiously. The driver was still inside. The engine sputtered before finally going quiet. Paramedics were already being dispatched. Within minutes, sirens could be heard approaching the scene. Residents watched as the street filled with emergency vehicles, ambulances, additional police units, supervisors arriving to take control of the scene. Crime scene tape soon stretched across the area, because once shots are fired, the situation changes immediately. The location becomes an active investigation. The officers involved were separated and escorted away from the immediate scene. This is standard procedure after officer-involved shootings. Each officer must provide an independent account of what happened. Those statements are later compared with physical evidence and video recordings. Investigators also began documenting the scene. Shell casings were marked on the pavement. Photographs were taken of the vehicle's position. Tire marks were examined to determine how the car had moved before stopping. Every detail would help reconstruct the final seconds before the shooting. But perhaps the most important evidence would come from body cameras. Most police officers today wear cameras during interactions with the public. If the cameras were active during the Newark incident, they would provide a clear view of what the officers saw. The driver's actions, the vehicle's movement, the exact moment when the officer believed the threat had become deadly. Investigators would review that footage carefully, frame by frame. Meanwhile, word of the shooting began spreading throughout Newark. Local residents discussed what they had witnessed. Some believed the driver had put officers in danger by accelerating. Others wondered whether the situation could have been handled differently. These debates often follow police shootings, because the public rarely sees the entire incident immediately, and without full context, people fill in the gaps with speculation. But investigators were focused on facts. They wanted to know exactly how the confrontation unfolded, how many commands were given, how quickly the vehicle moved, and how close it came to the officers, because those details would determine the outcome of the investigation. For now, one thing was certain. A routine police detention had turned into a violent confrontation in a matter of seconds, and the shooting in Newark was far from over, because the next phase, the investigation, would reveal whether the officer's split-second decision was justified. And that process was only just beginning. Shots fired. Shots fired. The radio transmission cut through the night like a blade. Repeat. Shots fired. Driver's been hit. Send EMS now. For a moment, the entire street seemed frozen in shock in Newark. The car that had surged forward only seconds earlier now sat motionless in the middle of the road, its engine sputtering as officers cautiously moved closer. The encounter had escalated in a matter of seconds. But now the real question investigators would ask was simple and critical. What exactly happened in those final moments before the gunshots? When officers approached the vehicle after the shots were fired, they moved carefully. Even though the car had stopped, the situation was still dangerous. Officers never assume a threat has ended until they are absolutely certain. Weapons remained drawn. Commands continued. Driver, show me your hands. Inside the car, the driver appeared slumped. The vehicle was still partially in gear, its headlights casting a harsh beam across the street. Officers moved to the sides of the vehicle, avoiding standing directly in front of it. If the driver suddenly accelerated again, the car could become a deadly weapon once more. Witnesses watching from nearby homes later described the moment as tense and surreal. Only seconds earlier, they had heard shouting and the roar of an engine. Then the gunshots. Now the street was filled with flashing police lights and urgent radio chatter. One neighbor later said the silence between the shots and the arrival of paramedics felt longer than it actually was. But in reality, emergency responders were already on their way. One officer cautiously opened the driver's side door. Another officer kept their weapon trained on the vehicle's interior. Standard procedure requires officers to maintain control of the scene even after a shooting. They must ensure there are no additional threats, no passengers, no hidden weapons. When the door opened, officers immediately began assessing the driver's condition. The driver had been struck, but he was still alive. EMS is almost here, one officer said over the radio. Officers are trained to provide medical aid when possible after a shooting. Even in tense situations, preserving life becomes the next priority once the immediate threat has ended. Some officers carry trauma kits designed to treat severe bleeding. These kits often include tourniquets and pressure bandages. Within seconds, officers began providing assistance while waiting for paramedics. The flashing lights of an ambulance soon appeared at the end of the street. Paramedics rushed toward the scene with medical equipment. Officers stepped back slightly, giving emergency responders room to work. The driver was carefully removed from the vehicle and placed onto a stretcher. Witnesses watched silently as paramedics worked quickly, speaking in urgent tones. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Within moments, it sped away toward the nearest hospital. But while paramedics rushed to save the driver's life, a new phase of the incident had already begun. The investigation. Whenever an officer fires their weapon, strict procedures are triggered immediately. The goal is to determine exactly what happened and whether the use of deadly force was justified. Supervisors arriving at the scene quickly began coordinating those procedures. The officers involved in the shooting were separated from one another. This is standard protocol. Investigators want each officer to provide an independent account of events without influence from others. The officers would later describe exactly what they saw, what commands they gave, and what made them believe the driver posed an immediate threat. Those statements would be carefully compared with other evidence. Meanwhile, the street itself was transformed into a crime scene. Bright yellow police tape stretched across the area. Detectives and forensic technicians arrived to begin documenting everything. Evidence markers were placed where shell casings had fallen. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. The position of the vehicle was recorded carefully. Investigators even examined the pavement for tire marks. These marks could reveal how quickly the car had accelerated before stopping. Witnesses were also approached by detectives. Anyone who had seen the confrontation was asked to describe what they observed, where they were standing, what they heard, whether they saw the vehicle moving toward officers. Some witnesses described the driver accelerating suddenly. Others said they heard officers shouting commands moments before the shots were fired. Each account would become part of the official record, but perhaps the most important evidence would come from body cameras. Most modern police departments require officers to wear body cameras during interactions with the public. These cameras capture both video and audio from the officer's perspective. Investigators reviewing body cam footage can see exactly what officers saw. They can hear the commands given. They can measure the distance between the officer and the suspect. And they can determine how quickly the situation unfolded. In cases involving vehicles, this footage often becomes the key piece of evidence, because it shows whether the officer had reason to believe the vehicle posed a deadly threat. Police officials soon released a brief statement confirming the shooting. They explained that an officer had fired their weapon during an attempted escape by a driver during a detention. The incident was now under investigation. Officials emphasized that such investigations are thorough and can take time. Multiple agencies may review the evidence before reaching a final conclusion. News of the shooting spread quickly throughout Newark. Local media outlets began reporting the story within hours. Soon, social media was filled with discussions about what had happened. Some people expressed support for the officers, arguing that a fleeing vehicle can pose a serious threat. Others questioned whether deadly force was necessary. These debates often follow incidents like this, because the public rarely sees the entire picture immediately, and without complete information, speculation can spread quickly. For investigators, however, the focus remained on facts. They would analyze every piece of evidence: body cam footage, radio communications, witness statements, physical evidence from the scene. All of it would help reconstruct the timeline of the encounter. The key question investigators would ask was simple: did the officer reasonably believe that the vehicle posed an immediate threat to life? If the answer was yes, the use of deadly force could be considered legally justified. If not, the shooting could face serious scrutiny. But for the officers involved, the night was far from over. After the shooting, they would undergo interviews with investigators. They would recount the entire incident from their perspective, from the first command given to the driver, to the moment the vehicle accelerated, to the split-second decision to fire. Those seconds would be analyzed repeatedly, because in incidents like this, everything comes down to timing. A movement, command, a vehicle accelerating, and an officer deciding whether the threat is deadly. Back on the street in Newark, investigators continued working long after the ambulance had left. Floodlights illuminated the scene. Forensic technicians carefully documented every detail, because when the investigation concluded, those details would determine how the shooting was judged. Do we have the body cam footage yet? Yes, 2 officers had cameras running. Witnesses? Several. Most saw the car move suddenly. And the vehicle? Still being processed. A quiet pause filled the investigation room. Then the lead detective asked the question everyone knew mattered most. So, when exactly did the threat become deadly? That question would guide the entire investigation into the shooting in Newark. because when an officer fires a weapon, every second leading up to that moment must be examined. The investigation began with the most critical evidence available: body camera footage. Modern policing relies heavily on these cameras. They provide an unfiltered view of what officers saw and heard during encounters with the public. For investigators, body cam footage can reveal details that witnesses might miss. The position of officers, the movements of the suspect, the exact moment when a situation escalates. Detectives reviewing the Newark footage began analyzing the encounter frame by frame. The video showed officers approaching the vehicle and issuing commands. "Turn the car off. Show me your hands." These commands were repeated several times. According to investigators, the driver did not comply. Instead, the engine remained running. This detail was important. A running vehicle creates an immediate possibility of escape or danger. Investigators also focused on the driver's movements inside the car. From the body cam perspective, officers appeared to be watching the driver closely. Hands on the steering wheel, eyes forward. The tension was visible even through the video, because officers know that in situations like this, a single movement can change everything. Then the key moment appeared on the footage. The vehicle shifted. The sound of the engine grew louder. One officer stepped backward. Another raised their voice. "Don't move!" But the warning came too late. The vehicle suddenly surged forward. From the camera's angle, the movement happened quickly. In less than a second, the car had moved several feet. The officer closest to the front of the vehicle moved sideways to avoid the car's path. Another officer shouted again, "Stop the vehicle!" But the driver continued moving. This moment became the central focus of the investigation, because police use-of-force policies often depend on whether an officer reasonably believed they were in immediate danger. A moving vehicle can be considered a deadly weapon if it threatens officers or nearby civilians. But investigators needed to determine exactly what the officer perceived in those seconds. Did the vehicle appear to be heading directly toward the officer? Was the driver attempting to strike someone? Or was the driver simply trying to escape? These questions would determine the outcome of the investigation. In addition to the body cam footage, detectives also examined the physical evidence from the scene. Tire marks on the pavement were carefully documented. These marks revealed how quickly the car had accelerated before stopping. Forensic technicians also examined the vehicle itself. They noted the direction the wheels were pointed. They measured the distance the car had traveled. And they inspected the area where officers had been standing. All of this information helped investigators reconstruct the movement of the vehicle. Witness testimony also played an important role. Several residents who had been outside that night described hearing officers shout commands repeatedly. Many said they saw the car move suddenly. One witness told investigators the car appeared to lurch forward, like the driver had slammed on the gas. Another witness said an officer had to jump aside to avoid being hit. However, not all witnesses described the event in the same way. Some said the car appeared to be moving away rather than directly toward officers. These differences would be examined carefully, because eyewitness memory can vary depending on perspective and distance. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the shooting were interviewed separately. This is standard procedure in officer-involved shootings. Each officer must describe the event independently. Investigators want to ensure that accounts are not influenced by other officers' statements. During these interviews, officers explained what they believed was happening in the moment. One officer reportedly said they feared the vehicle could strike an officer standing nearby. Another described the driver's sudden acceleration as aggressive and dangerous. These perceptions were critical, because under the law, officers are judged based on what a reasonable officer would believe in the same situation, not based on hindsight. While investigators reviewed evidence, police leadership addressed the public. Officials confirmed that the incident was being examined under department policy and state law. They emphasized that officer-involved shootings undergo multiple layers of review. Typically, 3 main groups examine these cases: internal affairs investigators, independent detectives or review boards, prosecutors who determine whether any criminal charges are appropriate. This process ensures that the investigation remains thorough and transparent. News coverage of the incident continued to grow in Newark. Local media outlets reported updates about the investigation. Soon, national outlets began referencing the case as well. On social media, discussions quickly became heated. Some people argued that officers must protect themselves when confronted with a moving vehicle. Others questioned whether the shooting could have been avoided. These debates often follow police shootings, especially when vehicles are involved, because determining whether a car was used as a weapon can be complicated. Legal experts began weighing in as well. Many noted that courts have historically recognized vehicles as potential deadly weapons. If an officer reasonably believes a vehicle could cause serious harm, deadly force may be legally justified. However, experts also emphasized that each case depends on its specific details: distance, speed, officer positioning. All of these factors matter, and that's why investigators were taking their time reviewing the evidence. As days passed, the investigation continued quietly. Behind the scenes, detectives were building a complete timeline of the encounter. From the moment officers first approached the car, to the instant the vehicle accelerated, to the gunshots that followed, every second was being analyzed, because those seconds would ultimately determine whether the officer's actions were justified. For residents in Newark, the wait for answers felt long. People who had witnessed the shooting continued discussing what they saw. Some believed the officer had been placed in a dangerous situation. Others remained uncertain, but everyone agreed on one thing: the encounter had escalated incredibly fast. In just a few seconds, a routine detention had turned into a shooting. Do we have the final report? Yes. Body cam reviewed? Multiple times. Witness statements? Confirmed. A long silence followed inside the investigation office. Then the final question was asked. So, what's the conclusion? For weeks, investigators had been examining every second of the shooting in Newark. Now the answers were finally coming together. But the conclusions would carry consequences, not just for the officer involved, but for the entire community. By the final stage of the investigation, detectives had assembled a complete timeline of the encounter. The timeline began with the initial police detention. Officers had approached the vehicle and issued clear commands to the driver. Turn the engine off. Show your hands. Step out of the vehicle. According to both body cam footage and witness accounts, those commands were repeated several times. But the driver did not comply. Instead, the vehicle remained running. And that detail would become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Investigators reviewing the body cam footage focused heavily on the seconds just before the shooting. The video showed the vehicle shifting gears, the engine revving, and then the sudden movement forward. From the officer's perspective, the car appeared to accelerate directly toward their position. One officer stepped aside to avoid the path of the vehicle. Another shouted commands for the driver to stop. But the movement continued. Those seconds became the central focus of the investigation, because determining whether the officer reasonably believed their life or another officer's life was in danger would decide whether the shooting was justified. The physical evidence supported the timeline shown in the video. Tire marks on the pavement confirmed that the vehicle had accelerated suddenly. The position of the car after the shooting matched the direction shown in the body cam footage. Investigators also mapped the exact location where officers had been standing. These measurements helped determine how close the vehicle had come to them. In situations involving vehicles, even a few feet can make the difference between safety and serious injury. Witness statements also played an important role. Several residents who had watched the incident described hearing officers repeatedly shouting commands. Many reported seeing the car move suddenly. One witness told investigators the driver appeared to slam on the gas. Another said an officer had to move quickly to avoid the car's path. While some witnesses believed the driver may have been trying to escape rather than strike officers, investigators concluded that the sudden acceleration created an immediate threat. And under the law, officers are allowed to use deadly force if they reasonably believe they are facing a deadly threat. Legal experts reviewing the case explained that vehicles can legally be considered deadly weapons. A car weighing several thousand pounds can cause severe injury or death if used aggressively. Because of this, police training often treats rapidly accelerating vehicles as potential lethal threats. This principle became central to the investigation's final analysis. If the officer believed the vehicle was about to strike someone, the use of deadly force could be considered justified. After reviewing all evidence, investigators reached their conclusion. According to the final report, the officer's actions were consistent with department policy. The report stated that the officer believed the driver's actions posed an immediate threat of serious harm. The sudden acceleration of the vehicle left the officer with only seconds to react. Under those circumstances, the use of deadly force was determined to be legally justified. Police leadership later addressed the public. In an official statement, they explained that officer-involved shootings undergo extensive review to ensure accountability. The investigation had included body camera analysis, witness interviews, forensic examination of the vehicle, officer statements, a review by independent investigators. After considering all of these factors, officials concluded that the officer's decision had been made in response to an immediate threat. But even with the investigation complete, public debate continued. In Newark, residents remained divided. Some believed the officer had no choice. To them, a rapidly accelerating vehicle represented a clear and dangerous threat. Others wondered whether different tactics might have prevented the confrontation from escalating. Could the situation have been handled differently? Could the driver have been stopped without gunfire? These questions are common after police shootings. Because while investigations focus on legal standards, communities often focus on broader questions about safety, training, and trust. For the officers involved, the incident would likely remain a defining moment in their careers. Split-second decisions in dangerous situations are part of law enforcement, but those decisions are rarely easy. Officers must react based on what they perceive in the moment, not what becomes clear afterward. And in this case, investigators concluded that the officer had acted based on a perceived immediate threat. The driver's actions that night would also become a key part of the story. By refusing commands and accelerating during a police detention, the driver had created a situation that escalated rapidly. What began as a routine encounter had turned into a dangerous confrontation in seconds. And those seconds changed everything. As the investigation closed, the street where the incident occurred returned to its normal routine. Traffic flowed again. Residents continued their daily lives. But the memory of that night remained with those who witnessed it. The flashing lights, the shouted commands, the sudden roar of the engine, and the gunshots that followed. The case also became part of a larger conversation about policing in America, officer safety, public safety, and the difficult decisions officers must make when confronting unpredictable situations. In many ways, the shooting in Newark reflected a reality of modern policing. Encounters can escalate rapidly, and decisions must often be made in fractions of a second.